If you ever find a smooth, pitch-black stone resting on your welcome mat, do not touch it. Do not kick it away. Do not pick it up to examine it under the porch light. Just run. Run as far as you can and never look back. I did not run. I made the ultimate mistake of ignoring the warning, and because of that tonight, I have to make a choice. A terrible, unforgiving choice. I have to choose who dies in my place. They say vampires are the only monsters that need an invitation to enter your home. They are wrong. What stood on my porch was not a vampire, but it played by the exact same rules. It all started on a Tuesday night. The kind of night where the weather keeps everyone locked safely inside their homes. I live in a small house at the end of a very quiet suburban street. It is isolated. The nearest neighbor is a good 10-minute walk down a road that barely has any functioning streetlights. I usually love the isolation. It makes me feel safe, hidden away from the noise of the city. The rain was falling heavily that evening. A constant rhythmic pattering against the window panes that usually puts me right to sleep. A faint moonlight struggled to break through the thick clouds, casting long, distorted shadows across my living room floor. I was sitting on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, drinking tea, and trying to forget about the messages on my phone. My ex-boyfriend Chad had been texting me non-stop for weeks. He was the kind of guy who refused to accept that it was over. His messages went from pleading to furious to downright disturbing. He knew where I lived, and that fact always lingered in the back of my mind like a dark, imposing silhouette waiting in the corner of the room. But tonight, the storm outside felt like a barrier holding the rest of the world at bay. It was just me, the pattering rain, and the deafening silence of an empty house. Around midnight, I realized I had left my mail in the box outside. It was a stupid little detail, but it bothered me. I opened the front door just a crack, letting the freezing wind bite at my face. As I reached out, I looked down at my welcome mat. Sitting dead center was a stone. It was perfectly smooth, completely round and blacker than the night sky. It looked like it absorbed the faint porch light rather than reflecting it. I felt a sudden, unexplainable chill run down my spine. It was not there when I came home from work. Someone had walked all the way up my driveway in the pouring rain just to place a rock on my mat. I quickly grabbed the stone, tossed it into the nearby bushes, grabbed my mail, and slammed the door shut. I locked the deadbolt. I checked the chain. I told myself it was just some kids playing a prank. A stupid, meaningless prank. I turned off the living room lamp, leaving the house bathed in a cold, thick darkness. The only light came from the flickering screen of the television, which was muted. I forced myself to go to sleep. At exactly 2 in the morning, the silence was shattered. It was not a loud noise. It was a slow but deliberate knocking. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was dull, as if someone was hitting the heavy oak door with the palm of their hand. I sat up in bed, instantly holding my breath. My heart was pounding out of my chest, beating so hard I thought my ribs would crack. I sat frozen in the cramped, dark space of my bedroom, listening. The wind howled, but beneath it, the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. My blood ran cold. The nearest police station was 20 minutes away, and that was in good weather. I crept out of bed, the cold wood floor sending fresh shivers up my legs. The creaking of the old floorboards sounded like gunshots in the quiet house. I moved toward the front door, stepping carefully into the narrow hallway. The crack of light from the street lamp outside illuminated a small sliver of the floor. I pressed my eye against the cold metal of the peephole. Through the distorted glass, I saw her. It was my best friend, Katie. She was standing on the porch, completely drenched in rain. Her hair was plastered to her face, and she was looking down at the ground. Relief washed over me for a fleeting second. I reached for the lock, ready to let her in from the freezing storm. But my hand stopped midair. Something was profoundly wrong. Katie lived an hour away. She did not drive, and she would never show up at my house unannounced at 2 in the morning. As I stared through the peephole, she slowly lifted her head. Her skin was pale, almost gray, but it was her eyes that made the hair on my arms stand on end. They were lifeless, wide open, staring straight ahead without blinking. And she was smiling. It was not a normal smile. It was a grotesque, twisted grin that stretched too far across her face, reaching her ears. It was a smile that lacked any human warmth. Then her mouth opened, but her jaw moved stiffly like a broken puppet. Her voice filtered through the heavy door, flat, monotonous, and terrifyingly calm. "Let me in. Please let me in." It did not sound like a request. It sounded like an imitation of a request. I stumbled backward, entirely paralyzed with fear. I clamped my hands over my mouth to stifle a scream. The thing outside was not Katie. It was wearing her face, but the entity beneath that skin was something ancient and malevolent. It knocked again. Knock, knock, knock. "Let me in. Please, let me in." I backed away, retreating into the absolute darkness of the hallway. I realized then why the stone was placed on the mat. It was a marker, a target. And this thing, this mimic, could not break the door down. It needed my permission. As long as I stayed quiet, as long as I did not say the words, I was safe. Or so I thought. Because just as I convinced myself that the front door would hold, I heard a different sound coming from the back of the house. The metallic clicking of the back door lock being picked. I stood frozen in the narrow hallway, sandwiched between two nightmares. The rhythmic knocking at the front door continued. Knock, knock, knock. But the sound from the kitchen at the back of the house was different. It was frantic, human. The harsh scraping of metal against metal echoed through the quiet house. Someone was trying to force the lock on the back door. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The sudden buzz against my leg made me violently flinch. I pulled it out with trembling hands. The screen glowed with a harsh, bright light in the pitch-black hallway. It was a text message from Chad. It read, "I know you are awake. Open the back door. Let me in, or I will break it down." The air in the house suddenly felt too thick to breathe. I was trapped. At the front door, an ancient mimic wearing the face of my best friend was waiting patiently for an invitation. At the back door, an obsessed, angry man who had hurt me too many times before was actively breaking into my home. The isolation I had always loved was now a death trap. I had no neighbors to hear me scream. The police would never make it in time. I crept toward the kitchen, my bare feet, avoiding the creaking floorboards out of pure instinct. I peered around the corner of the hallway. Through the small glass window of the back door, I could see his outline. Chad. His dark, heavy jacket was soaked from the storm. He was digging into the keyhole with some kind of tool, cursing under his breath. The sheer violence in his movements made my stomach drop. I knew what he would do to me if he got inside. I had the scars to prove it. I backed away, retreating into the cramped, dark space of the hallway closet. I pulled the louvered doors shut, leaving only a narrow slit to look through. I huddled in the corner, surrounded by old winter coats, breathing heavily through my nose. I gripped my phone, my thumbs hovering over the emergency dial, but I knew it was useless. He would be inside before the dispatcher even answered the call. Then a new sound pierced the heavy silence. A sharp scratching noise coming from the front door. It sounded like long, jagged fingernails dragging down the wooden frame. The entity outside was getting impatient. "Let me in." The voice was no longer just Katie. It morphed. It shifted into the voice of my mother, who had passed away 5 years ago. "Please, sweetheart, it is so cold out here. Just open the door." The sheer psychological torture of hearing my dead mother crying in the rain sent a fresh wave of nausea washing over me. Crash. The sound of shattering glass erupted from the kitchen. My heart stopped entirely. Chad had smashed the window on the back door. I heard the crunch of his heavy, muddy boots stepping on the broken glass. He reached his hand through the jagged hole and unlocked the deadbolt from the inside. The door groaned as he pushed it open, letting the howling wind and rain sweep into the kitchen. "I am inside." His voice rang out in the darkness, laced with a terrifying anger. "Where are you hiding? I pressed myself flat against the back wall of the closet, squeezing my eyes shut. I was completely paralyzed by the overwhelming dread. I could hear his heavy footsteps slowly moving from the kitchen into the living room. He was hunting me. Meanwhile, the scratching at the front door grew more frantic. The mimic knew someone else had entered. It wanted its turn. "Please let me in." The voice morphed again. This time, it sounded like a little girl crying out in pure agony. I was trapped in a tiny wooden box, while a violent stalker searched my house and a demonic entity clawed at my front door. I had no weapons. I had no escape route. I was going to die in this house tonight, unless I made a choice. A sick, twisted choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life if I survived. I realized that the thing at the front door did not care who invited it inside. It just needed to hear the words. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the reality of my situation. The smell of old coats and mothballs in the cramped closet was suffocating. Chad was walking down the hallway. I could hear the heavy thud of his muddy boots sinking into the carpet. Thud, thud, thud. He was dragging his hand along the wall. I could hear his fingertips catching on the wallpaper. "Where are you hiding, sweetheart?" His voice was a sickening mixture of mocking sweetness and underlying rage. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying the power trip of hunting me inside my own home. At the exact same time, the scratching at the front door became a frantic, desperate clawing. It sounded like a wild animal trying to dig through solid wood. "Please." The voice from the porch morphed again. This time, it was my own voice. It sounded exactly like me crying out in pure terror. "Please let me in." It was mocking me. The entity knew exactly what was happening inside. It was feeding on the ambient fear. I had to make a choice. If I stayed in this closet, Chad would find me. He would rip the louvered doors open, and that would be the end. If I tried to fight him, I would lose. He was twice my size and fueled by insane anger. But the thing outside, the mimic, it was a predator. A predator that was currently locked out of its hunting ground. I realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that I could use it. I could use the monster to kill the monster. It was a sick, twisted realization that made me feel entirely hollow inside. I was about to invite pure evil into my home, but survival is a primal instinct. It overrides morality. It overrides sanity. I slowly pushed the closet door open just a fraction of an inch.
Please.
The rusted hinges let out a tiny metallic squeak. In the dead silence of the hallway, it sounded like a siren. Chad stopped walking. The heavy thud of his boots ceased immediately. He heard it. He knew exactly where I was. I saw his dark, imposing silhouette turn slowly toward the closet. A cruel smile spread across his face, visible even in the dim light. "Found you!" He lunged forward. I burst out of the closet, throwing myself into the hallway just as his heavy fist smashed through the wooden louvers where my head had been a second before. Wood splintered and showered down on my shoulders. I scrambled across the floor, my bare feet slipping on the polished wood. I crawled frantically toward the front door. The front door where the scratching had suddenly stopped. The entity was waiting. It knew the climax was approaching. Chad grabbed my ankle. His grip was like an iron vice. I screamed, kicking wildly, hitting his arm, his chest, his face, but he did not let go. He dragged me backward along the floor. "You are never getting away from me." He snarled, his face contorted in absolute fury. He raised his fist, preparing to strike me. I looked at the front door. It was only 3 feet away. The heavy deadbolt was locked. The wood was solid, but the entity did not need the door to be open. It only needed the words. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the stale, dusty air of the hallway. I stared directly at the heavy oak door and screamed at the top of my lungs. "Come in." For one agonizing second, nothing happened. Chad froze his fist, suspended in the air. He looked at the door, confused by my sudden shout. Then the temperature in the hallway dropped violently. I could see my own breath forming white clouds in the air. The heavy oak door did not open. It did not break. But the shadows around the door frame seemed to bleed into the house. A thick, unnatural darkness oozed through the cracks around the hinges and beneath the door sweep. It pooled on the floor like black ink spreading rapidly toward us. Chad let go of my ankle, backing away slowly. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. His anger evaporated, instantly replaced by pure primal terror. The shadow rose from the floor, taking shape. It was incredibly tall, far taller than a normal human. It had no distinct features, just a shifting mass of absolute darkness. But the eyes. The eyes were two pinpricks of pale, dead light. It looked down at Chad. The air filled with a sound that I can only describe as a chorus of 1,000 whispered voices speaking all at once. I scrambled backward, pushing myself against the wall, making myself as small as possible. The entity ignored me completely. I was the one who gave the invitation. I was not the target. Chad turned to run. He scrambled toward the kitchen, his boots slipping on the floor. But the entity moved with impossible speed. It shot forward, enveloping him completely. Chad screamed. It was not a normal scream. It was a sound of absolute agonizing torment. A sound that tore through his vocal cords and shattered the silence of the night. I covered my ears, pressing my hands so hard against the sides of my head that it hurt. But I could still hear the sickening sounds. The sound of heavy cloth ripping, the wet tearing of flesh, the snapping of thick bones, the wet thud of something heavy hitting the floorboards. The sounds went on for what felt like hours. I squeezed my eyes shut, sobbing uncontrollably, terrified that if I opened them, the thing would turn its attention to me. Finally, the screaming stopped. The horrific tearing sounds ceased. The hallway fell dead silent. The only sound left was the steady rhythm of the rain outside. I stayed curled in a ball against the wall, shivering violently. I did not move. I did not open my eyes. I sat in that dark, narrow hallway for hours, waiting for the dawn. When the first gray light of morning finally crept through the living room windows, I forced myself to open my eyes. The hallway was empty. There was no shadow monster. There was no blood. But Chad was there. What was left of him anyway? His body was twisted at impossible angles. His clothes were shredded into tiny pieces scattered across the floor. His face was frozen in an expression of unimaginable horror. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. I threw up immediately, violently emptying my stomach onto the floor. I crawled away from the grotesque scene, retreating into the living room. I found my phone lying near the couch. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. I told them someone broke into my house and attacked my ex-boyfriend. I told them I hid and did not see anything. I lied. I lied to the police, and I lied to myself. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They secured the scene, taking photos of the broken back door and Chad's mangled body. The lead detective told me I was incredibly lucky. He said it looked like an animal attack. A very large, very violent animal. I just nodded blankly, wrapping a shock blanket tightly around my shoulders. They eventually left, taking the body with them and taping up my back door. They told me to stay at a hotel, but I refused. I just wanted to be left alone. After the last police cruiser pulled out of my driveway, I locked the front door. The silence returned to the house. It was not a comforting silence anymore. It was heavy, oppressive. I walked slowly through the living room, feeling completely hollow. The trauma of the night weighed on my chest like a physical burden. I walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I reached for a glass, my eyes fell on the kitchen counter. My heart stopped. My breathing hitched in my throat. The glass slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering into 100 pieces on the floor. Sitting perfectly still in the center of the clean marble counter was a stone. It was perfectly smooth, completely round, and blacker than the night sky. It was the stone from the porch, the marker, The invitation. I had invited the entity into my home. I had told it to come in, but in my blind panic, I had forgotten the most important rule of the invitation. I never told it to leave. If you ever find a smooth, pitch-black stone resting on your welcome mat, do not touch it. Just run. Because if you let them in, they never ever leave. If you are listening to this, and you have ever felt that cold, unexplainable chill in your own home while you were completely alone, you might already have a guest. Have you checked under your bed lately? Have you looked closely at the shadows in your closet? If you survive the night, share your story below. And do not forget to subscribe to Lost Horror, because next week I will tell you exactly what happens when you try to throw the stone